Well, ladies and gentlemen, I must be honest and say that 2026 is certainly proving to be a very, very exciting year for news. And I must say, I'm loving it because it's actually really amusing. So let's actually get on with the news of today. But before I do, can I yet again remind you, subscribe to the channel, really helps. The usual stuff. Please do help me get to 200,000 subs. In any case, let's get on with the first news. Let's check in with London. So how's London doing? Well, London has officially inaugurated the embassy of the Palestinian state. Now, they've upgraded the Palestinian mission after the UK recognized the Palestinian state. Who's the leader? What are the borders? Where do they have their official capital? We don't know. But in any case, the ceremony is being hailed as historic by Palestinian officials, who suggest that this new Narnia-based state that nobody's ever heard of, and they don't really know where the borders are, is all great. Now, Israel warns that this shift risks rewarding diplomacy, that's giving the Palestinian Authority diplomacy, without actually ever confronting the terror or the governance issues that are currently driving the conflict between Palestine and Israel. Now, I, for one, look at the entire thing and think, that's nice. Apparently, we are now recognizing a fictitious state and even opening embassies. I mean, they're going to issue a passport to where? An airport where? Where exactly is this Palestinian state? I don't know. Well, neither do they, but they don't care because it sounded great. In any case, let's move to Iran. Well, news came out today that apparently a massive explosion was reported in a factory in one of Iran's provinces. But the explosion pretty much looked like a nuke. In fact, you can have a watch right here.
چه تیتاش داده هر دفعه اینو بلو ببین چه نگاهیه ده
Now, all of this comes at a time when the protests are actually intensifying in Iran. People see the end of the Ayatollah in sight, and they're pretty much getting very, very desperate to get rid of the Islamic State. Now, Iranian forces have reportedly stormed a hospital looking for an imam. They blasted through corridors with tear gas and were looking for the patients and individuals who they class as being involved in the unrest, and they are attempting to subdue the unrest by being heavy-handed with members of the state, with the idea being that they want to crush dissent obviously of the demonstrators who want the Ayatollah gone. Now, you don't have to take my word for that. Here, have a watch. But you see, individuals don't really care what the Iranian authorities want to do. They just want to see the Ayatollah gone. And this is leading to many of them to set fire to many of the billboards that the Islamic State has pretty much put up in order to try and encourage people to stop revolting. Have a watch. Now, so far, the regime has reportedly killed 18 protesters. Now, I, for one, am asking the question of Trump said that if the Iranian authorities go heavy-handed with their citizens, that he would step in. So I'm still waiting, Trump. When are you stepping in? Because, 18 people are dead already. Now, you may look at all of these conflicts and say, well, why are we talking about these? Because, well, it's the current thing, right? So obviously, Palestine just got itself its own little embassy, even though no one's talking about Palestine anymore. And obviously, Iran has forms of civil unrest where hospitals are being targeted and no one's running through to the ICJ. But what they are doing is the activists have quietly dropped their Palestinian flags and are now picking up the Venezuelan flags, because the new current thing is, well, Venezuela. And if you don't believe me, have a watch. So these activists, which you could see on screen, are obviously in London, or screaming and shouting in their Venezuelan flags. And then last week they would have been in their Palestinian flags, which is raising the question of whether or not none of this stuff is organic. Like, no one cares about these issues. In fact, a lot of them are being made political issues through, well, some unscrupulous individuals who no one's really talking about, right? So, I mean, these are all bought and paid for actors. But they're bought and paid for actors that are sowing dissent in national states. And this is being exemplified by, well, what's going on now in Venezuela. Suddenly, everybody cares about Venezuela, even though nobody cared about it before. Now, you see, if they really did care about things, they would go back to look at what's actually happening right now in Iran. Because even Iranian protesters are outside London trying to encourage individuals to support Iran and even Israel, because they don't want the Ayatollah. In fact, have a watch. So as you can see, people are waving the Israeli flag, they're waving the Persian flag, they just want the Islamists gone. But do they care? Do the leftists care? And the answer is no. And the reason they don't care is because insert the current thing. Anyway, let's talk about the current thing, and that's Venezuela. Now, as you'll know, the United States has just drastically escalated its posture in the Western Hemisphere, in Venezuela. But having done this, there is the potential of a spillover into Latin America. Now, this escalation is being interpreted by critics as the return of the hard US sphere of influence doctrine, under which they enforce their will through force rather than diplomacy. And South Africa finds itself increasingly at odds with Washington, both diplomatically, ideologically, and rhetorically. And they're still economically exposed to US power, so they can't just tell the Americans to footsack. Now, in typical fashion, the left in America, because, the left is just nutty regardless of where you are in the world, has denounced Trump's arrest of Nicolás Maduro. But you see, they conveniently forget that there's this amazing thing called the internet, and the internet keeps a very long memory. Now, what's interesting is that the left, the Democrats, actually announced a $25 million US reward for information leading to the arrest of Maduro and refused to recognize him as Venezuela's legitimate president. This was under Biden. Now, Washington claims Maduro lost the elections and backs the opposition leader as the president-elect. The fact is that Maduro stole an election. He is a dictator, and he's a dictator that's destroying his country. Now, following the US military operation that resulted in his capture and that of his wife being captured, he was transferred to US custody. Now, the US frames this as law enforcement and democratic restoration, restoring the rightful elect. But critics are framing it as an act of war against a sovereign state. So which is an act of war or the restoration of democracy in a democratic state where the previous leader refused to step down? You can tell me, but what you can't say is that Trump somehow did something that the Democrats weren't prepared to do, because it was actually the Democrats who announced the reward in the first place who wanted to arrest him. Now that Trump's done it, well, it's a bad thing because, orange man bad. Now, commentators in South Africa are not immune to being brain dead, because many of them are now suggesting that what's actually occurring is that Trump is attempting to revive the Monroe Doctrine and is instead rebranding it informally as the Monroe Doctrine. Ha ha ha, you think they're clever, they're not. In any case, Latin America is being treated explicitly as the US sphere of control, when ultimately is what this whole conflict was about. If you watch my video from yesterday, please go watch that video. I spent a lot of time on that video. Then you will notice that the America said very clearly that the reason they got involved in this was basically to keep the Americans American. They didn't want the Americans, even South America, siding with Russia or China. Now, they've used force to secure strategic and economic interests, well, specifically oil, but ultimately the whole reason for this was to exclude China and Russia. Now, Trump publicly suggested that similar action could now occur again, specifically in Cuba and Mexico, which could be the next targets unless they curtail the cartels. And military action is not being ruled out in Cambodia, which is next door to Venezuela, who says that they don't like what Trump's done there, and they're suggesting that they go to war with them. And he says, sounds good. Basically showing that US power is back, and his restraint is gone, and he will slap you one if you get in his face. Now, leaders in the region are warning that this signals a return to neo-colonial behavior, because that's what leftist socialists always come down to. It's always neo-colonial, and given the left's partnership with Islam, one is forgiven for wondering why they never noticed that the most colonial power on the planet is Islam, but they love to partner with them, so I don't really think their issue is neo-colonialism. Their issue is that there's a guy over there that they don't get on with or like, and he's going to come over here and give them a honey. That's really what the issue is. Now, Cambodia's president suggests that Latin America risks being treated as servants and slaves if not united. Well, I don't really know what the servants and slaves bull rubbish is, because Latin America is a dump. It is economically poor through all of the socialist dictators that have run up and down and mismanaged all those countries into oblivion. But in any case, those individuals who live underneath the socialist order there, who would quite often describe themselves as servant and slaves, well, those individuals aren't worried about what's happening with Trump. In fact, they're worried about the regimes that they currently have to live under. But it's amazing how this form of projection onto others always occurs, where you accuse them of doing the very thing that you yourself are doing. Now, fears tend to grow that the regime change by force is becoming acceptable again, and so we don't really know what other areas in Latin America may be forced to change. And this is causing South Africa also to have a degree of heart palpitations, because they don't get on very well with Trump at the moment. Now, South Africa has strongly condemned the US action, calling it a violation of the UN Charter, warning that it sets a dangerous global precedent. I mean, if it is a precedent, then maybe they could be knocked off next, God willing. In any case, they called for an emergency US Security Council meeting, and Pretoria is arguing that if this is all allowed, then any powerful nation could justify invading weaker ones. Yeah, it's pretty much like what happened between Ukraine and Russia, an ally of South Africa. Well, in any case, South Africa suggests that the global norms of protecting sovereignty would effectively collapse, with weaker states being at the mercy of stronger ones. Now, this clash between the US and South Africa is coming at the very worst time. And the reason for that is because South Africa's ICJ case against Israel, which the US wants withdrawn, as well as accusations from Washington that South Africa is aligned with Iran and anti-Western blocs, the very people who, well, Trump is busy going around the world and beating up. Now, another reason for it is what the US regime is calling South African racism, specifically BE, and its anti-white positioning, which is leading to, as you know, the white genocide narrative. Now, a US ambassador, the newly appointed US ambassador to South Africa, has reportedly made targeting South Africa's ICJ position his diplomatic priority. So he's suggesting that if South Africa refuses to back down, it will deepen the standoff with the United States. And we've already seen what that standoff could look like. Bye, Cyril. But the ANC isn't worried, because they are now praising the New York new mayor, which is Mamdani. Now, Mamdani, during his inauguration speech, actually invoked Mandela and the South African Freedom Charter, claiming that the two were responsible for his ideological positioning. Now, Mbalula suggested that because Mamdani was now the mayor of New York, that South Africa still has friends in America, specifically Mamdani. Now, this all at the same time that Mamdani is being associated with the hard left. I mean, he's a communist. He's also pro-Palestinian, and he has forms of BDS activism. Now, for those of you who don't know what BDS is, well, it's a movement, and it's a Palestinian-led campaign, and it effectively means boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions movement. And as you can imagine, well, it was inspired by, would you guess it, South Africa's anti-apartheid movement, and it's being directed at, well, as you can imagine, as Israel. But yet again, we see the South African name coming up in American discourse, and not in a way that we would really want it to. But critics in the US are noting that Mamdani opposes the arrest of Maduro, whilst he himself suggested that he would happily arrest Netanyahu were Netanyahu to come to New York underneath the ICJ International Arrest Warrant, even though the US is not a signatory. I mean, he's a hard left guy and he wants to push them pro-Palestinian stuff, which is why he conducted his inauguration as mayor of New York on the Quran. First time that's ever been done in the US. But what this does all show you is that there is an ideological split occurring, with the ANC aligning rhetorically with global leftist causes, which I highlighted in my video yesterday, and the US leadership moving in a nationalist power-centric direction. And the result of that could be that South Africa's caught in the middle. Now, South Africa's economy is being squeezed through political dissent from the US. South Africa is increasingly having to become reliant on China, and China's imports to South Africa are rising, and that's increasing our dependency on China to get goods into the country. But imports into a country makes a country vulnerable, because what it means is that we are sending our cash abroad to buy stuff, and we are not manufacturing things in the country of origin. And a lot of this is occurring because of the US tariffs. Now, long term, what this actually means is that South Africa will not be an export economy, it will be an import economy. And you don't want to be an import economy as a third world economy with no tax base, because effectively what that means is that there's no one here to generate money. And long term, it will lead to the collapse of your state. And this is all occurring because of the trade wars with the US. Now, there is something else that came to the attention of South Africans this week, and that is that in 2018, the ambassador to Venezuela suggested that he would loan the Venezuelan army, or the Venezuelan state, the SANDF, in order to fight US military action. Now, that offer to send South African troops to Venezuela in order to counter American might is suddenly hitting the news again, and you can imagine why, because South Africa had to put its foot in it and go out there and publicly condemn the US for everything that there's done, and even attempt to get the international bodies, such as the Security Council, to somehow do something, I don't know what, because you see these international bodies have no global army, they have no global standing, and all you have to do is just go, footsack, and nobody cares, there's no ways to enforce. But South Africa is South Africa, and they can't help but get involved in everything that doesn't involve them. And this is also leading to Washington itself to then say, as you can see, these guys were never our friends. I mean, they even attempted to go to war with us in 2018. Maybe this is the right time to take them out. And this high-stakes game that South Africa now finds itself in is not very comfortable for the average ANC stooge. Now, the US has signaled that it's willing to use force to remove unfriendly regimes, and is perfectly happy to ignore international norms as strategic interests demand it. And so the question on everybody's mind every single day is, at what point, because of South Africa's opposition to the US, from a diplomatic position, from a diplomatic standpoint, at what point will America get rid of the ANC by force? At what point will we wake up in the morning and read the headline, Ramaphosa has been captured overnight, taken to New York for trial? And I think we can all say, safely, that we hope that day comes soon, inshallah. In any case, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.